Okay, I think we can get started. Thanks everybody for being on time and taking your seats. So I'm Bob Breunig. I'm the director of the Tax and Transfer Policy Institute. It's my job to welcome you here today. So I'm also here representing Helen Sullivan, the head of the Crawford School of Public Policy. Crawford is very happy to host this event, which is a key public policy issue around housing and aging. And as director of Tax and Transfer Policy Institute, I'm, of course, keenly interested in this issue as well, because I think a lot of, when we think about housing and aging, particularly the interaction of those two things, it's hard not to think about tax and transfer policy settings and some things that you might want to change, even if you might not politically know how to make them happen. So that's my kind of welcome. And so before we begin, I want to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet, pay our respect to any Indigenous people present, and our respect to elders past, present, and emerging. So this policy dialogue is jointly hosted by CEPAR and CAMA. CAMA is the Center for Applied Macroeconomic Analysis and located here in the Crawford School of Public Policy. Established in 2003, and it's put together an incredible worldwide network of macroeconomists doing research on a wide variety of areas. And I know I've seen several of you before at various CAMA conferences and events. We had a fantastic data workshop in April with CAMA, and CAMA runs an annual conference with Treasury here in Australia and then with Brookings in the US. So that is one of our sponsors. The other sponsor is the ARC Center of Excellence in Population Aging Research, which is a national research center funded by the ARC. It's multidisciplinary in nature, committed to delivering solutions to one of the major and economic social challenges of the 21st century. The center is based at UNSW. It also has nodes here at ANU, at Melbourne, and at the University of Sydney. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was the first of the ARC Centers of Excellence to also be refunded for an additional 10 years. Is that, or one of the first? No, but it has been refunded. First social sciences one to be refunded. I knew it was the first something, but anyway, it's a mark of the success of the center that it's continuing to get funding. So the policy dialogue here provides a forum for leading Australian and international experts, policymakers, business leaders, researchers, and commentators to engage in a multilateral discussion and contribute to the development of policy both in Australia and abroad. And this year's topic is housing and aging. And as you will see on the program and experience during the day, there are a wide variety of participants, both from Australia but also from overseas, some of whom are here, some of whom are joining us via technology. So I will switch now to introducing the first session of the day, which I'm also going to chair. So the first session is called Setting the Scene, and there are two main speakers. The first is Professor John Piggott. The second is Rafal Chomik from UNSW Sydney. So both of them are coming down from University of New South Wales. I'm going to ask both speakers to speak for 20 minutes. John, Rafa, is that okay? And I'll sit in the front and flag you down if you go over 20. All right. Yeah, that's. I think that's perfect. As an economist, I believe in not too much regulation and gains to trade. So I think the two of you can work it out. We then have Professor Judith Yates from the University of Sydney, who will comment, and John Simon from the RBA as well. And both of you will have 10 minutes if that's all right. So I'm not going to read the bios at great length because you have them on the program, but just briefly. So John Piggott is director of CEPAR, very important person in the success of the center, and a longstanding interest in retirement and pension incomes and finance. And I've known John for about 20 years now, and one of the most respected applied economists in Australia. And has done a tremendous amount of work with World Bank and a variety of other international agencies. Rafa is a senior research fellow at CEPAR. Rafa and I met in a panel data course that I taught, so I can assure you that any panel data analysis he presents will be of the highest quality, provided he followed my detailed instructions. So he's been working on social policy design, public and private pension analysis, poverty and income measurement, all very important issues. And then the commentators, Judith Yates is an honorary associate professor in the School of Economics in the University of Sydney, has had more than a 40-year career in academia, has also been involved with several major inquiries in finance systems and housing as well. And John is head of the Economics Research Department at the RBA. He's positioned the research department as thought leaders within the bank who promote a culture of intelligent inquiry and analytical excellence. And I can attest to that in the fact that in conferences and also at the RBA and elsewhere, I get to interact with a lot of researchers who are working at the RBA, and I think RBA has created a really nice environment for people to do high-quality empirical research about Australia, and you have a lot of excellent people working with you as well. So I'll let you read the details of all those bios on your own, but that's just edited highlights from me. Okay, so John, are you happy to kick off now? Great, thanks.
I'd like to add my welcome to you all. It's a great pleasure to be here, and this is, I think, the third or fourth of a series of policy dialogues with which, where we've had in cooperation with the Crawford School and CAMA and CEPAR, and I'm hoping this will be even more successful than previous events. Along with this comes a research brief, right, which looks like this, and there are copies out there which you're welcome to take. One of the things we try to do in CEPAR is to translate the research that we do, and Rafal Chomik, who is going to follow me in this introductory session, is primarily responsible for this, and he does a terrific job because he doesn't just report CEPAR research, but he also provides a narrative and supporting statistical analysis which weaves into something that hangs together as a synthesis. And I think that's turned out to be really valuable in other domains, and I'm hoping it will be valuable here. So it's my job to open this, and I thought rather than focus on anything too kind of specific, because there's a lot of specificity in this, and Raf is going to take you through some of that. I just make a few points about housing generally, and I can do this like this. I think the first point is that housing is kind of a unique commodity in most societies. And if you go back to Alfred Marshall, a 19th century economist, you'll find that he is very concerned about housing. He thinks good housing means people drink less alcohol. That's one of the things he said. I'm not sure whether this is true. But that it's also very important for production, very important that people are able to go to work from a base of housing, and very important for children's education. And he actually advocated wealth redistribution toward the poor, because that way they could have a house and then the poor could get well educated and society would benefit. It was less an end in itself than a means to additional productivity via education that he saw the importance of redistribution of wealth. So he saw housing as central. The UN, of course, regards it as a human right, adequate housing. And that's sort of been put into place in most spectacularly, I think, in the case of Singapore, which was really an emerging economy back after the Second World War, and was guided through reasonably hands-on social engineering, I think. One of the major planks of that was the Housing Development Board, and now 90%, I'm told, 90% of Singaporeans own their own homes or have equity in their own homes. And that's a very high number for a country that's had that kind of evolution. So he saw that as very important. It does seem to have gone along with Singapore's economic development more generally. We did have when Australia first federated, there was George Nibbs. He was our first Commonwealth statistician, and his masters back in London wanted him to come back. He said, I'm not coming back. Right? This is a wonderful country. Right? 1 person in 6 is the owner of property. Right? So it just gives you a historical perspective on how housing has become so much more important now than then, but was seen then as a vehicle toward greater participation, greater, I guess, material participation in society than had been the case in the past. So I'd just like to think briefly about how housing fits in various contexts. So the first thing I think about when I think about an aging demographic is really the life course. And so rather than just focused on the aged, think about how housing fits in. And I have in my mind, and I've had in my mind for many years, the idea that saving takes place in a sequenced fashion, or investment takes place in a sequenced fashion. And first you invest in your own human capital, because the earlier you do that, the higher the returns. You get returns for longer. And then in the sort of society and financial setup that we have, the next investment to make is housing, because you can leverage it very highly. And high leverage is something that you can perhaps afford to do when you're young rather than when you're old. So the next thing you sort of really get into is housing. And there's an enormous amount of risk that people take on in buying into the housing market. So it's not that people are risk averse, it's that they feel comfortable doing this. This is something that's natural to do. And there are a lot of externalities to owning your own home, the community that you develop around you, and social networks and so forth. And then after that comes financial saving, and usually people have to be kind of nudged and pushed and compelled to do some financial saving, because money's pretty scarce in your 30s and 40s, particularly if you've bought a house and particularly if you have children. So there's a bit of a push and a shove going on there. And then finally, there's some discretionary saving, which usually takes place in later middle age. And there, people quite often buy investment property. And it's worth reflecting on why, because they could buy, and they could negatively gear, any kind of asset. So why do they go for investment property? Well, I think there are 2 reasons. One is that a lot of the returns in investment property, at least historically, and perhaps into the future as well, have been in the form of capital gains. And the capital gains get taxed at half the rate and are not available until realization. So if you've bought the investment property for your retirement, then you're going to face a lower marginal rate, and you can realize the property and pay a discount on that lower marginal rate. So the tax side of things looks pretty attractive. But as well as that, housing itself, investment housing itself, operates as a little bit of a commitment device. It's harder to get out of investment housing. You can, of course, borrow against it, or you can slow down your mortgage payments. But by and large, people I think try and invest in investment housing because you're stuck with it for quite a while. It's expensive to keep changing, and that helps people in their saving plans, which are very hard to stick to, as we all know. So that's sort of how I see housing fitting into the life course. And then there is, well, how does it fit with policy? So principal residence housing, all governments, I think, want you to do this, right? This is a very important thing that you're asked to do. Governments want you to own a home, because then you're going to be less dependent on social protection in later age, and there are these other benefits as well of community development and stability and so forth. So usually, all around the world, housing, owner-occupier housing is given tax preference, I think appropriately so, because it's something that you use to try and get some income smoothing between present and future consumption. And it's a major saving channel in many economies, particularly Anglophone economies, less so in continental Europe, where you have major leasing agreements and so forth. And actually, it's the pension funds that own the residences then, own residential housing. Right? In Anglophone economies, by and large, we see home ownership as something that's aspirational, something that most people should try to achieve. So it's sort of taxed like pension saving in many countries, and here it's more mixed, but it ends up kind of being taxed like pension saving. And then there's this nest egg roll, then you've got this asset in retirement. So this acts first of all, as a source of bequests. So if you have a bequest motive, it also acts as a form of precautionary saving, and people talk a lot about long-term care, aged care costs being covered with the value of the home, and that's certainly one risk that's not really well insured, that it's nice to have some capital around to do. There are probably other more amorphous risks, just as a sense of you don't know what's going to happen and you need some precautionary saving, and housing does that for you. And of course, people talk about long-term care insurance, but one part of this is that if you have a bequest motive, right, and you want to have bequests, you want to give a bequest, then actually it's to your benefit not to take out long-term care insurance or aged care insurance in your own right, but rather use that precautionary saving as a self-insurance mechanism, and then they fit together. It works quite well. And so then there is a question of whether, in policy terms, whether access to housing, getting into the housing market is going to mean we're going to have greater inequality for the upcoming generation. I think that's something that's a genuine concern and something that needs to be addressed and understood, and I'm hoping we'll get somewhere today with that. And finally, as I said, I should have said this at the end rather than the beginning, that there's family stability and all that, right? So how does it fit then with an aging demographic? And this is my last slide. Well, the first thing is, what we're observing at the moment is delayed home purchase. So one question is that consistent with other kinds of delays that we observe? And Rafal talked to this, but the answer in broad terms is that it is, right? That there are many, many things that are being delayed, right? Like marriage and the birth of a first child and your death. So there are other things that get delayed, like your death, right? And so I don't think that's the full story, but I think it's perhaps more of the story than some of the community commentary on there we are, lower home ownership amongst younger cohorts suggest, right? So I think that's something that's definitely worth exploring today. And then, if people live longer, and particularly live longer after they cease working, right, there is a question of downsizing. People talk a lot about downsizing. It doesn't happen that much until a spouse dies or there's some major life event. But it may become more important if people live post-work for longer. And there are a lot of impediments to downsizing, and they might need to be looked at. And then finally, you know, there are implications about waiting too long for your bequest, right? A bequest is of limited value to you if you get it when you're 70. And in some cases, that's going to be what would end up happening. So look, I'm going to leave it there. I hope I didn't cause this eruption. There's my last slide, and I'm going to turn the podium over now to Raf. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So it's my job to give you a bit of an introduction to the research brief that we're launching today, which highlights some of the work within CEPAR. So do grab a copy. I'm just going to give you a flavor of it. We've featured work from over 20 CEPAR researchers, some of whom are here. Thanks to those who commented on drafts, and also to Sophie. I don't know, is Sophie here? Thank you to Sophie for all the amazing work, my co-author. And I'm going to just switch my phone off. So a lot has been written about housing and home ownership, about the role as a nest and a nest egg, and how those roles are potentially being eroded. What we do here is look at those questions through the prism of demographic change, and seeing how expertise in population aging can potentially add and offer some insights. So this is my broad outline. I'll first talk about home ownership trends, then introduce demography into it, and talk about the retirement income system and some of the outcomes out on the ground. So estimates of home ownership differ a lot. You see a lot of different numbers, and sometimes it's a little bit confusing. So we looked at how the methodologies differ. So you can have home ownership figures based on the counting of persons, number of people, households, adults, income units. You can also look at the tenure observed As you can imagine, if you count young people with the tenure of the household, with the parents' household, then home ownership will be higher. And then there's also differences based on survey data. So is it census, is it household surveys such as HILDA and SIH? So we wanted to test some of the assumptions and see what the trends are like across all these various permutations. And so that's what we did here. So depending on the measure, total ownership in Australia currently ranges from about 60% to 70%. The common count of households with household measure is in green, which overstates ownership of actual people in black based on their or their partner's legal tenure. But whatever measure you look at, the pattern is quite similar over the long term. So post-war increases in home ownership, stable at high level, and then a decline in the last 2 decades. Home ownership's down about 3 to 4 percentage points in the last 2 decades. But I would say that in terms of this chart, note that it starts at 57%, so it adds a bit more drama than necessarily is there. And if you break that down, you can see ownership over time and by terciles of income distribution and age. I'm here counting persons with their or their partner's actual legal tenure using Survey of Income and Housing. Overall, drops are led by young households of all incomes and middle-aged households of low incomes. We don't see yet changes past age 65, but in middle age, low-income individuals have very large ownership gaps with high-income people of the same age. We know about these trends from other people who've written about this over the past few decades. We also know about the usual explanations that go with this, and often it's to do with affordability. So declining affordability is the commonly cited explanation. Over the past 20 years, house prices have grown faster than household incomes and certainly faster than costs, than building costs. And this in turn is put down to cyclical as well as structural factors, such as the rental demand created from new migrants. I don't know why those lines have dropped there. That shouldn't be there. Those things there. That's a straight line across there for natural births. So weird. So a surge in rental demand from new migrants, about 3.7 million new migrants since 2000, and you can see that in the red line, but also the natural increase since migrants have children. So you can see a little bump going through across there in green as well. At the same time, low cost of credit was capitalized into prices, but a lot of the credit allocation went to favored investors, supported by tax rules around negative gearing and capital gains tax discounts. And then, of course, there was the supply lag, about 10 years between peak increase in demand and peak increase in supply, up from about 3.5 years in the past, and I'll show you a little bit of that in another chart later on. So the higher price and lower mortgage borrowing costs relative to income have changed the purchase dynamic. We've heard about the deposit hurdle, so let's see what that looks like with respect to the income and house price distribution. So this is how many years it might have taken in 1996 to save for a 20% deposit, depending on your income quintile across from top to bottom, and shown for house prices that you might want to look at, of quintiles of house prices across left to right. So a medium household buying the median house would have needed about 4 years, a second quintile household buying in the second quintile of prices just over 4 years. And the bottom quintiles were, as you can see, already being priced out. So this changed by 2016. Not only are prices further from income, also savings compound less as you want to accumulate this deposit. So households in the second quintile buying in the second quintile of prices moved from just over 4 years to just over 6 years of savings needed. In fact, everyone has moved down a level, as you can see with those colors there. So the hurdle change would be greater if you took account of the actual deposit needed. So it used to be that you needed smaller deposits than the 20%. And also, I haven't looked at the geographic differences here, but we know that median incomes within capital cities have moved away from median incomes within those median prices within those capital cities have moved away from the median incomes. But if you look at mortgage costs, the direction is actually in the other direction. So, as you can see, for example, the second quintile, buying in the second quintile, moved from 44% of mortgage cost as a proportion of income to paying 36%. But you can see that there's less of the red as we move to the more recent period. So it's a sort of basic analysis, but it demonstrates the wider point that we know that from pension economics that, and John referred to this, that people find it difficult to save. And so what might have been happening in the past is that the lower hurdle at the beginning meant that people were using housing as a commitment device. So they were purchasing a house and then they were committed to higher savings over the extended period. And that commitment device is less available now because the initial hurdle is greater. Okay, so that's some of the affordability story. But as John mentioned, we also looked at demographic change context. So the median age of first buying a house decreased from 1960s and 1970s as ownership became more widespread. It then started increasing, which is the more familiar story. It increased by 9 years from 1981, from age 24 to 33. But this pattern must be seen in the wider context. So here is that wider context. It accompanies delays in all other major life events. First job has been delayed by about 2 years, finishing education by about 5 years, having children 7 years, marrying 8 years, and of course within the much greater envelope of life, which means a median age at death has moved by 12 years. And these are all related. So Peter MacDonald has written about this about a decade ago. He'll be telling us about some of this later. Wrote about this, that younger households delay home ownership, and that's associated with choices to delay the decision to marry and have a family. Note that this is a period measure, so events later are underestimated. So the people buying their house at age 33 will have a longer life expectancy than the 82 that you see here. So deferring their home purchase by 9 years will still probably see them living in their house for longer than their parents did. I also add caveats that, of course, not everyone follows the same neat patterns of life events as shown here. And I come back to what happens with people who do defer indefinitely and what happens in retirement. But the message is that some declines in ownership are not unusual, and we would expect it within this context. And so possibly some of the projections are also overstated in terms of what the catch-up might be in future. And this is just a similar thing. This is just since 1981 and shown in terms of weeks per year. So since 1981, because that's the largest increases that we've seen in delays in home ownership of first purchase. And you can see that delay in house purchase is about 13 weeks per year, only slightly higher than the delay in entering full-time work and marriage, about 10 weeks per year, and less than the average annual increase in median life at about 15 weeks per year. And we see this pattern across different countries too. So prices have moved around in different countries. Some have mostly increased, but not all of them. But the decline seems to be common amongst younger age groups. So for example, Italy, Switzerland, and Germany didn't really see the sorts of increases that we've seen here, but still young people are owning less. And the other part of the demographic story is that, and again, this is to quote some of Peter's work, is that there's also been a shift in terms of migrant composition within younger age groups. So this chart shows you the tenure patterns by visa and migration status. A lot of ownership among the long-settled and hardly any among long-term temporary migrants. And so that affects the what you would expect to see in terms of ownership patterns in Australia amongst younger age groups, which will potentially filter out as that temporary migrant age group is not there at later ages. So still staying with demography, here we updated some analysis of underlying household housing demand and supply. The first thing to notice is that 10-year lag that I talked about from peak in 2008 to peak in 2018 in terms of supply following it. Whereas before, the lag used to be about 3 to 5 years, as I said. Next, in the short term, the demand for housing seems to be expected to remain strong, so supply declines most recently are concerning. But over the long term, the base projections see a shallow deceleration in growth of demand, but the range is particularly wide. So it varies depending on population assumptions and household formation assumptions. Also, our analysis on cross-country variation in house prices and demographic change suggests that population aging will weigh down prices somewhat, even though it's a minor factor compared to all the other factors. So, for example, since 1970 to 2018, the demographic change is estimated to have contributed to 7% to higher prices. But if we are seeing deferral in the purchase of homes, there are some key questions to think about. So for example, whether mortgages will be around after a certain age. Remember that exits from the labour force, which I showed you here, only increased by 3 years leaving labour force. So that's less than the increase in later home purchase. So the question is, to what age can you actually defer? And as you can see here in this chart, older owners are retiring with mortgage debt. In 2016, about 36% of home-owning households still had a mortgage at the point of retirement, up from about 23% a decade earlier. And for some, it might make sense, since given the low levels of interest, but it's still a potential concern. Now, John also mentioned bequests. Will bequests help? You sometimes hear about the wave or wall of inheritance that is about to collapse. So we just wanted to test some of that a bit, and looked at the distribution of houses and the distribution of cohort life expectancies, which we allow to vary by income quintile. And really what you end up seeing is that there is not really a wave or a wall about to collapse, that boomers really have a lot more time to go, and bequests can be expected to be much more ordered than some of the metaphors suggest. As John said, age of bequest receipt is delaying while gifts are happening at earlier ages. So we checked this around 2001 based on Hilda. The largest average bequests were received by people aged 45 to 49, whereas the largest bequests around 2017 were received by those who were 55 to 59. And the reverse was true for gifts, but much smaller, which tend to be much smaller, but are happening at younger ages than in the past. And the other point about those is of course, that gifts and bequests tend to happen to people who are rich already, so there is a kind of inequality story there. So that brings us to the retirement income system and some of the interactions. So this point will be familiar to many. The means-tested age pension ignores the family home, which means that people with over 1 million in net wealth receive about 2 billion worth of age pension. And this is while the age pension is the same for both renters and owners. As a concession to renters, they can have financial assets before losing an age pension, more financial assets before they lose the age pension. So the extra disregard or free area is there. But that can only really, we looked at the numbers, and that really means 3% of renters can take advantage of that extra area that they receive. Of course, renters receive rental assistance, but there are issues with that. So first, it's pegged to the wrong index, as shown on the left. CPI rent grows much faster than CPI general, although over the most recent period that has changed. Secondly, the relativity between singles and couples is a potential issue. So we see that outcomes for single renters are far worse than couple renters. In 2009, the age pension was increased for renters because there was an analysis that looked at the relativities and the economies of scale that different households have. So singles received a greater age pension. Perhaps a similar thing should be looked at for Commonwealth rent assistance. And finally, those on unemployment benefits may have it toughest, but there is a merit to separate CRA for working age people and old age people, given the different experiences at later ages and incentives faced by older people. The other tension, and John touched on this as well, is between home ownership and super. So these charts show you the percentage of wealth in super by age and decile, and percentage of wealth in home equity. So super is more important for younger, lower income households, and housing is more important for the middle, and of course, housing equity builds up over time with age. As John mentioned, the two are complements, so super is more liquid in retirement, and housing investment can be leveraged to get greater capital gains, greater wealth accumulations when prices are rising. And that potentially introduces an inequality to go into the future. So you can't really leverage super to take advantage of increases in prices and increases in stocks, whereas you can leverage housing. So you're potentially seeing a divergence there. The extent to which one limits the other is still an open question, and it's a very important question, and I think something that the retirement review will be looking at. It relates to the debate about the 12% contribution increase as well. Should younger households be exempted or allowed to opt out? Would doing so make them save for a house or make them miss out on compound interest? Given the point that I made earlier about the hurdle for the deposit, it may be that mandated savings would help overcome those new behavioral barriers. Okay, so that's some interactions. So I just want to finish with some of the outcomes for renters. So there's going to be still people who do end up renting in retirement and people who indefinitely defer. So what are the outcomes now, and what are the potential prospects, and how is the retirement income system looking after them? So you can look at this in different ways. Here, I'm going to show you relative poverty. One of the things that you often see is that relative poverty of older people in Australia is quite high. And this is OECD numbers that don't take account of housing. And in fact, they're inaccurate as a result. So I worked in a team that produced those numbers at one point. And a lot of that is to do with the breadth of countries available. So the simpler measure, not taking account of housing, covers all member countries, whereas the more narrower measure covers only about 20 or so, 24 in the figure that I'm about to show you. Because when you do calculate the poverty rates for renters only and compare them across countries in terms of relative poverty, and you take account of housing costs and the imputed rent, Australia's poverty rates are particularly high. So they're among the highest in the OECD. But of course, we don't have all countries. We don't have Korea, which tends to have very high poverty rates, including with housing. So actually, I haven't done this for Sophie. We might need to do this for single renters, because I wonder whether the contrast will be even sharper. So that's relative to the median, but you can also do it relative to one's own income. So here, a popular way of doing this, and one adopted by COAG, is to look at housing affordability. So having low income and spending more than 30% of one's income relates to housing affordability stress. So as you can see, older renters in 1996 had lower housing affordability stress compared to rates seen amongst young renters, but this reversed by 2016. So rate doubled from 65 to 74-year-olds, as you can see in the chart. The pattern for owners, however, is revealing, because it underlines an earlier point despite price increases, the mortgage stress has generally declined for owners. A final way to look at it is what the extreme end of things might be. So it's kind of an absolute outcome, which is homelessness. We've heard about numbers of homeless older people, that homeless older people have increased a lot, especially amongst older women. So we looked at this finding, we kind of dug into it, and it's interesting that actually a lot of this increase is driven by, increases in the numbers of older people within the population. So if you actually look at incidence, which is shown here, some of the increase amongst older women and older people comes out. But that's measured homelessness. One of the things is that perhaps some people, older women, might be better at concealing homelessness, so the way that the census might capture some of this is missing it. So we looked at what access to homelessness services looks like. And if you compare it to the growth in annual growth in population over the period 2011 and to 2016, there's really a disproportionate increase in access to specialist homelessness services amongst older age groups, and particularly amongst women. So that is my run-through of some of the narrative that's within the document. Yes, home ownership appears in decline and market dynamics play a very important role, but we must take account of some of the demographic changes and the deferral that is taking place. Indefinite deferral of home ownership has consequences, especially given that the retirement income system isn't looking after renters very well, as evidenced by the financial gaps that are growing between renters and owners. So please grab a copy of the research brief. It's got lots more in there, and you can in fact use your phone right now to download it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for the opportunity to comment on the presentations. And I'd like to start off by complimenting both presenters for doing such a great job in setting the scene for today's policy dialogue and for providing us with such a comprehensive range of data and policy sort of issues and considerations. Now, I want to do three things in my allotted time. I think a little bit ungenerously, given Raf's given us so much data, I want to actually add a few little more the bits of data I think he could have that are needed to set today's scene. And then I'll have a look at John's and, again, add some more questions that I think that we need to make sure that we consider. Because I think that the issues, the relationship between housing and ageing have to be seen in a long-term time frame. I think it's a real pity that, for example, housing is not in the intergenerational reports, because it's one of those things that is going to potentially have a future. So if there's anyone here who's anything to do with the IGRs, hey, how about getting the housing chapter in on the next one? Okay, Raf's presentation basically had focused on really two key points that I had to do from his slides, so rather than from necessarily what you covered today, but that was very similar, I think. I'm going to focus mainly on the first one for the moment. I'll come back to the second one right at the end. So Raf recognised the potential role played by market dynamics and affordability constraints in affecting home ownership outcomes, but he focused mainly on the possibility that it's just delay or deferral, and argued that actually you've got to see this delay or deferral in the context of all the other demographic changes that are going on. And you actually suggested, I think, that it may be easier in the future to get access to home ownership, possibly because of population trends. And in some ways, that way of looking at it rang a few alarm bells for me. Firstly, seemed to me there was an assumption, I may be wrong, that there would be lower demand because of the lower population growth. Maybe that was going to reduce housing prices. I'm not quite sure of the mechanisms why that was going to happen. And I was hoping that our second commentator would actually make the point that there is evidence to show it's affordability constraints that have been the main driver of declining home ownership rates rather than demographic changes. But John tells me he's not going to do that, so... I can do it now. But on the economic drivers, which I think are really critical, we need to actually look at, I think there needs to be more attention paid to what I'll briefly summarise as distributional and spatial issues. Now, I've highlighted a couple of trends or outcomes that I think are really relevant because of their potential they have in changing the structure of home ownership in the future. And this may be ignored if we just look at demographic trends. So the first one relates to trends in income and wealth inequality. Both of those are going to affect the demand for housing and access to home ownership for particular groups. And they both have a significant impact on what's been happening to housing prices, and particularly on the spatial distribution of housing prices. They tend to go together. Oh, excuse me, thanks for that, Bob. Low income and low wealth tend to be associated, not just overall on the right-hand side, but within every age group of wealth. I've separated out the wealth outcomes for those who get into the market, who are owners or purchasers, and those who don't get into the market at all, the grey bits, who stay renters or are renters at any point of their life cycle. I think, for example, it shows you that huge difference in inequality, except at the very, very top ends, which I don't think we have to worry about too much. That rising inequality has very significant spatial outcomes. I've picked $500,000 as an indicator of median house price Australia-wide, not in Sydney for sure, because that's roughly what a household of median incomes in today's very favourable borrowing conditions could buy, as long as they can find a deposit of around about $100,000, no mean feat. So you can see that there's not very many very pale yellow places in Sydney. You get the same sort of picture in Melbourne, but not quite as bad as Sydney. And I did have one on units. It's a bit better for units, obviously, but those 5% that I've got up there, 6%, would creep up to about 30% if you put units into the equation. So what's happening is that housing that's affordable for lower income households below income median level, they're out either not in the cities, or if they are in the cities, very much on the fringes, or to a less extent, smaller dwellings that aren't always appropriate for all households. So that Raf had some hypothetical charts about low income and house purchase and what you needed, but hypothetical examples don't necessarily take into account the reality of what is actually available out in the market. There are some projections and concerns that the current trends in home ownership rates are going to lead to a little less than 60% home ownership rates in the future. And I think this really does raise significant questions about the implications of using home ownership as a pillar of retirement incomes in the future as the population ages. And so consideration of these sort of distributional and spatial aspects brings me on to the points I want to make about John's presentation. John had a couple of questions. I won't deal with all of them or in any detail. But the first one centred on the life cycle savings. And you start off by saying, okay, the first step is you invest in human capital and then in housing. But it raises the obvious question of what happens when there are constraints on access to both or either form of investment. If you look at pre-retirement life stages, all those people are either squeezed out of locations which provide ready access to educational or training opportunities and later to jobs. They're going to fare less well than those who are more advantaged and have better access to educational opportunities, training opportunities, and job opportunities. And likewise, as Raf and both John and Raf mentioned, children whose parents who are either renters or who have been pushed out into areas where there aren't capital gains in housing to the same extent, they're going to less likely be able to get the bequests in the future that provide access to housing. So what happens is the housing, through these distributional and spatial outcomes is going to contribute or potentially contribute to an intergenerational transmission of disadvantage. And there's strong international evidence that intergenerational mobility, in other words, movement up and down the income scale, decreases as income inequality increases. Second point John made was on social development. I'm going to skip most of those points, although I think there is a bit, we need to separate out what's about housing and what's about home ownership or a particular form of housing. But I'm going to run out of time to do that in too much detail. But I just want to raise the point about home ownership as potentially an equalising distribution of wealth. From that aggregate data I just had a moment ago, it's fairly obvious that's not the case. Any housing and superannuation are actually both major contributors to wealth inequality. And any apparent equalising effect is just a life cycle thing with a lot of relatively lower income households still having the high wealth from the past. There are huge intra-generational inequalities in wealth and income between owners and renters, as I showed you. And those cohort differences will be reinforced to the extent that home ownership declines in the future. A further point I'd like to make about housing and inequality is that we sort of attribute access to housing to savings behaviour, but as Piggott showed in his sort of mammoth work that he did on capital and inequality, most of our housing wealth arises from economic rent, from the unearned gains that arise from increases in land value. And these have very little to do with individual effort. And so that does raise questions about policy, which brings me to John's third question. I think we need to ask, John raised the question about, pointed to home ownership as being, or everyone owning a house or as being part of government policy. But I think we need to ask the question of whether we're actually killing home ownership with the kindness that we provide it through the tax system, or indeed through our financial system in relation to access to finance. Over the last decade or so, we've had many concerns about first home buyers being squeezed out of the housing market by investors. And despite much of the political rhetoric about mum and dad investors just being ordinary average income households, investment housing tends to be the domain of high income, high wealth households, most of whom are also owner-occupiers. Our tax system encourages this. Our financial system makes it easier for well-heeled buyers to not just get access to housing finance, but to get disproportionately greater mortgages because of their higher incomes and higher capacities to pay. So one potential scenario over the next generation or so is that ownership of housing will be concentrated in the hands of households in the upper part of the income and wealth distributions, either as owner-occupiers or as investors. So John asks whether the difficulty of access to housing will drive inequality for the upcoming generation. And I fear the answer is yes, it will. And it's not just because of the role played by bequests and the ability of homeowners to use their housing to improve their standard of living, as Raf was pointing out at the end of his presentation, but also because of those spatial disadvantages created by the way in which unaffordable housing pushes lower income households away from the job opportunities where housing is priced out of their reach. So the final question that John had related to how housing fits with ageing. Again, just a few observations. I'd say point out that many of the issues talk about things like reverse mortgages and all those sort of things and downsizing. These are only applicable to households who are already wealthy, who already have assets. And I do wonder whether these people should be a priority in terms of policy issues. But even in terms of downsizing, which is one of the issues that comes up a lot of time, I think one of the impediments often not considered is whether there is a suitable stock available for them to downsize into. I mean, I've lived in a certain area, a certain location. I can downsize relatively easily, but I can't downvalue. it costs me just as much, because of the location, because of the land prices, to move to a smaller dwelling as it would to things. So I'll stay in my house that's most probably too large. And you think of lower income households who have deferred, or as Raf might prefer, delayed home ownership, and who are not wealthy, the question of whether they'll have enough superannuation to become owners in retirement is totally irrelevant. It's academic, they're unlikely to have anywhere near enough. So I'll conclude with just a couple of extra questions for consideration. I'm not going to answer these, but I do think that it's really important that we consider them and keep them in mind. On the first two questions up there, I think we do have to look at the factors that are contributing to the rising income and inequality that we're experiencing, and particularly to the role that housing might be playing in that. On the third question, we might, for example, consider whether requiring low income or even moderate income retirees to use their assets to fund aged care, or whether including the family home in the assets test increases or decreases inequality, given that high income, high wealth households are going to be totally untouched by such policies. We need to consider whether redistributing the generous support that is currently provided to all owners of housing should be redistributed so that we can make sure we cover the cost of addressing the pressing needs of housing and ageing, which, as Raf pointed out, are low-income households who enter retirement without any assets. So, thank you for your representations.
So I don't have any slides, and I don't actually have any, well, I'm going to refer to a little bit of data as I talk, but really because this is the setting the scene session, what I really want to do is ask people to ask themselves questions as we're going through. And that is, we've had a lot of microeconomic focus here, a lot of details about individuals, how they go through their life and the decisions they make. But coming as I do from a macroeconomic institution, I want to encourage people to look at the forest, not just the individual trees in that forest. Because generally speaking, everything's connected. If you change one thing, it has consequences on another thing. And also when we're asking these questions about what should we do with respect to housing policy, you need to recognise that you can't just look at the first step. So let me give you an example. We talk about the rental and the ownership split. But at least from a macroeconomic perspective, the household sector as a whole owns the entire housing stock. We've got a distributional issue within that some people own more than one house. They live in one and they rent out the other to other people. But at least far as the macroeconomy is concerned, every house is owned by someone, and that someone is in Australia, usually another householder. So it's not a problem that the overall ownership isn't correct. Another example I want to give you is we talk about somebody taking out a loan, getting heavily indebted, But what happens is they get a lump of money to buy this house, but they then give this lump of money to the existing owner of that house. Now, that existing owner is either going to pay off the mortgage they have, or maybe they're going to downsize and they're going to have a larger lump of money. So if you follow that through, what you see is that it's not people getting heavily indebted, it's some people getting more indebted and some people getting less indebted. Now, when we look at what's going on in the economy, we notice, for example, despite all this discussion about people are paying off their mortgages very quickly and they're trying to pay it down debt, what you'll notice is that housing credit is actually still growing. So for every person that is paying down their mortgage, somebody else is taking out a loan, and somebody else is taking out a slightly bigger loan at the moment. It's much slower than it was. So that's kind of the general idea I want to give you, which is that it's all connected. And perhaps the other thing I want to point out, I guess, coming from the Reserve Bank and wanting to give a perspective about how we fit into that, is if you read the commentary, you'd think that we are the only people who can control the housing market. We move interest rates a small fraction, and suddenly the market is either booming or busting. But really, I think that gets the causality wrong, and this is part of a general point I want to make, which is that because everything is connected, you change one thing and a lot of other things change along the way. And it's not necessarily the fault of that little one thing that you changed. It's a consequence of everything else that is going on. So, for example, yes, we change interest rates, but there is a degree to which some of those interest rate changes we make are not discretionary. You'll notice around the world, interest rates are low around the world. And so when you talk about what's the effect of us lowering interest rates on the price of housing, we recently put out some research which showed that if you lower it by 1% for 3 years, that would have an effect of raising the house prices on average by around 8%. That's not particularly huge. If you make that a permanent change, that is, we lower 1% interest rates forever, the effect is about 28%. Now, the first one is something we have control over to the extent that what we're doing is we're doing a cyclical change in the interest rate in order to try and smooth out the economy. The second one is much more a reflection of what's going on around the world. There are generally lower interest rates around the world, and we, to a certain extent, are moving along with it. For example, if we didn't, the exchange rate would appreciate, people would find it much harder to export, economic activity in Australia would generally go down. So when we're moving interest rates, part of it is going to be a cyclical effect, and that's actually relatively muted compared to a much longer term structural change that is going on. Now, the reasons for that structural change, lots of speculation out there. Part of it is demographic change. We've got a very large lump of baby boomers who are moving through, and they're going to be moving into a retirement. Another aspect is they've accumulated a lot of savings. And so the value of something is usually how scarce it is. The world at the moment has got a lot of savings, which means that the price of that, the price of money, is generally going down. So that's an aspect in which there are a lot of things moving around, and you can't necessarily look at one change here and say that that's necessarily going to be the sole thing. So, for example, if we say that housing affordability is a problem, or conversely, retirement incomes for self-funded retirees is a problem, should we raise interest rates to affect that one part of the market? I think if you look at everything being connected, you would end up saying, well, trying to fix one problem using something else that certainly has an effect on it, without taking account of all the other things that are connected, might lead you to a worse situation than you preferred. So that's essentially my 2 points, and say that whenever you hear somebody talking about something here today, you should ask yourself, well, why is that? So, for example, why are house prices so high? We did some research at the Reserve Bank which suggested that a lot of it has to do with the value of land. And not just the scarcity of physical land, but the right to build something. So I think Judy mentioned she'd like to downsize. Now, I wonder how many people in her area have been against development. So they're in their 40s and their 50s, and they're saying, I don't want any high-density housing. I don't want any townhouses built. I like my quarter-acre block. 20 years later, they say, where are all the affordable dwellings that I can downsize to? So I think we need to see that, one decision in some place that may be rational at one point in time may come back to have consequences later. So whenever you hear presenters here, all I want to encourage you to do is say, yes, but what happens next? And is that really the cause of it, or is that merely a secondary thing? So thank you.
The speakers have been laudably disciplined in their use of time, which is a good thing. It means we have lots of time for questions. So we have about 25 minutes for questions. We've got a few mics, or a mic to circulate. So I'm happy to start with someone out here. I have some questions myself as well, but. Up in the back row here.
So question to Rafal. You talked about whether or not entering into a mortgage is a useful disciplining device to help households save. So it sort of doesn't really matter at the top end because high wealth households generally save a lot and will buy a house and financial assets. At the very bottom, low income households can't really save at all and typically won't accumulate very much wealth at all. But in the middle, there's those households that are sort of on the margin of being homeowners. And so I was just wondering, is there actually any research in Australia that matches those households and looks at their behaviour overseas where buying a house actually changes their savings behaviour over the life cycle?
So, I mean, I don't really have a definitive answer. When we looked at the extent to which, say, superannuation has increased total savings while limiting, perhaps for some households, credit constraint, we didn't really find a lot of evidence sort of showing that one or the other is actually increasing total savings. In terms of specific households, we haven't really looked at or haven't seen the evidence that kind of shows and answers the question that you've posed. That was just, as Judy also mentioned, a hypothetical example showing, you know, what would it look like if you looked at the prices in each year and the incomes in each year, and it's pointing to this greater hurdle, but in terms of actually looking at specific households, we haven't done that sort of work.
Judith, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I think there's certainly the evidence that if you get into housing, then your wealth is going to be greater. I'd like to show that difference at every age group and every income category within that group. Owners have a lot more wealth, no matter how it's saved, than do renters. And renters are people who don't own any housing at all. But it doesn't quite answer the question, but
that's correlation, not causation.
Yes, exactly.
There was a question here. Yep. Silke, we'll make you go as far as we possibly can with the mic.
Thank you for the terrific presentations. A two-part question, or two separate questions. The first one's more a comment. There is a curious census category called non-private dwellings. If you think renters are badly off, those in non-private dwellings are even worse off. A small category, but if you're in it, you're never going to get out of it, and as you grow older, you're more likely to get into it. So Hilda certainly wouldn't pick them up, but I'm just wondering whether they're included. But my question really, and I guess it's for Rafal, the graph that showed the difference in the OECD countries, the ones that were worse off in terms of looking bad, I guess, does that take account of, or if you took into account the provision of public housing, how would that change? And Australia certainly is one of the countries that has a low level of social housing and is one of the solutions to increase the provision of social housing instead of selling it off. And I guess those people who object to medium density housing, they'd go absolutely ballistic if it was going to be medium density housing for low income earners.
So on the non-private dwellings, the homelessness data captures some of that. So in certain types of dwellings, they would be categorised as potentially homeless. In terms of the public housing story across countries, yes, that data is captured. So the incomes that are measured include imputed rent. So public housing would result in higher incomes because there's an imputed rent that can be taken from that data, and that would be added to their incomes before calculating whether or not they fall below 50% of the population median, which also includes imputed rent across the board. So that would be captured in that data. In terms of what the public housing rates are across those countries, I don't have that data to hand. But yes, some countries have definitely greater levels of housing, public housing than Australia.
John, I had a question for you, which was that when Judith mentioned about lending practices, you said there were two reasons why you thought that people went for investor housing, but you didn't mention lending practices. And you did say that people can gear for non-housing investments, but if you go to the bank and say, I want to buy $1 million of shares, the bank is likely to say, well, I'll lend you 600,000, and you have to put 400 in yourself. If you go to the bank and say, I want to buy $1 million investment property, the bank is likely to say, well, here, why don't you borrow 1.2, and that way you can pay the stamp duty, and you'll also have a little bit left over. So I guess, can you just maybe, I just wanted to get a response to Judy's comment about lending practices.
No.
I'm just being told by this Reserve Bank official that doesn't happen anymore.
I have some anecdotes from people that it does, John. We'll talk later.
Yeah, I do think that the risk characteristics of these different kinds of assets vary, and banks take that into account, for sure. I was really referring, what I was trying to get at was that there's a certain matching between the kinds of things that people with resources might need in order to organize their finances over the life cycle and what the characteristics of an investment residential property. And as I said in passing, if you take Switzerland, which is a country that has a high standard of living like Australia, in fact higher, right? Less than 50% of the population own a home. And home ownership is something which is very largely undertaken by pension funds. So pension funds own most of the homes. So owning a home actually puts you in a very privileged position there. I guess one of the concerns that I have is that if people are indeed being squeezed, and that has a long-term structural effect in terms of getting a home, if that's the case, right, then we could be perhaps not as bad as Switzerland, but we could be in a situation where maybe only 60 or 65% of people at retirement had substantial equity in their homes. And I think that would be that would be it's a very serious matter. I mean, Judith emphasized intra-generational distribution. And I think that's the future generations, intra-generational distribution is something that I think we need to pay close attention to. And I think housing is one vehicle through which that can be changed for better or worse.
So I had a lot of questions now. So I think Warwick had his hand up first, and then I see 4 others. So.
Yeah, thanks very much for 2 great presentations and great discussion comments. Judith raised a really important question, and that is, what's the problem? What are we trying to deal with here? And I think there's 2 aspects to the presentations. One is, how do people behave? And the second one is, can housing be used as some form of policy lever? Can it be used to change income distribution, or can it be used by the Reserve Bank to change economic policy? And we know from other countries, in fact, and this, I can't resist John's suggestion. So if we look at the US under the Bush administration, they decided they wanted everyone to have a house. And they made it possible for everyone to borrow and have a house. And then they distorted the financial system so much that as interest rates went down to 1%, notably Australia didn't follow that path. Australia took a totally different interest rate profile, didn't have a financial crisis, didn't have a great recession. We did manage to de-link interest rates. But we did see that this desire for a particular outcome for the community to have housing led to a massive distortion in the financial system. And the cost of doing that is still being paid by not just American citizens, but people around the world. So the question is, I mean, I like the presentation on how people behave. The second question is, should housing be used as a policy lever for a whole range of different issues? I think is a serious discussion we need to have, because I think everybody wants to use housing for a particular policy reason, including the Reserve Bank. And it actually may not be the right thing to do when you look at the big picture.
Does anyone want to take a swing at that?
I'd make a comment. Is that we talk about the need to pool risks in superannuation a lot. This is some of the difficulties. But I think we never talk about the same thing with housing. And, you know, if you look at the American case, you put a lot of low-income households who didn't have a capacity to pay, and then when things went wrong, we didn't support them and keep them there. We let them go up, and that's contributed to the crisis. So that we have to look more broadly about how we treat housing in terms of pooling risks as well.
I will perhaps... So I'll give perhaps a related point on my theme, which is that I think the problem you could argue is that having decided that everybody should own a home, you didn't also make sure that people could afford to pay for it. And one of the big problems in the US was the failure of prudential regulation. So what you had is this great impetus on just get somebody into a home, and let's not think about what happens next. Hence you have your ninja loans, no income, no jobs, no assets. So I think that's also the message for here is if we decide we want to change something, you need to do more than just one thing. Any change, given the way everything is linked together today, must involve surely a package of changes that thinks through the consequences and makes allowances for what are the knock-on effects going to be.
Now that we're really in the mood, there was a gentleman 2 rows behind Warwick who had a question. I'm going, yeah, you had your hand up earlier.
Could you identify who you are?
Oh, that's a good suggestion. Yeah, just say who you are.
Recording me?
Just wondering if you could help me think this through. It seems like both of you are saying, well, I took it from John that John was saying essentially in a macroeconomic discussion, demographics, and especially the baby boomers, are very important to understanding where the sort of lower for longer story is in the world right now. So it's a very important factor globally. But perhaps with Raf, it seemed that the demographics was a smaller thing, at least in terms of explaining house prices. So I just wondered if I misunderstood that. And sort of picking up Warwick's question, it is clear, isn't it, that housing is being used for policy purposes in Australia, just not the traditional settlement purpose. It's more an investment good for people to save, or for some people to save. Is that correct?
So I do think it's, I won't say definitely, I think it's arguable that the social protection structure that we have is built around the idea that most people will end up owning some kind of dwelling that they live in. Right? And the way we've structured social protection in some sense relies on that. So Raf had a slide, and I think it's a striking finding, right, that the poverty rate amongst renters in the post-65 cohort is amongst the highest in the OECD. Right. 3 speakers, Raf, myself, and Peter McDonald, have just returned from the East-West Centre in Hawaii last night, right, where there was a conference that was focused quite heavily on Korea. The Korean Development Institute co-funded it. Right? And exactly the same point was made there. They have 70% home ownership at retirement, and the 30% are really poor. Right? So there are 2 questions. I mean, one question is how poor? And let me tell you, you'd rather be here as a renter, age 70, than in Korea. That's for sure. So the concentration of renters in the lower part of the distribution of income in late age, right, is really another way of saying, if you have the resources, you buy a house. Right? That is a kind of preferred asset purchase. And you could argue that there's a whole menu of policy settings which generate that, and which are not present in Switzerland to the same degree.
Perhaps I can offer a corollary to that, which is I think a lot of policy observes that wealthy people have houses and presume that houses cause wealth. Whereas I think what you've really got as a problem is there are some high-income people and some low-income people. And if you start trying to get people into houses, as they did in the US, believing that owning a house is good of itself without dealing with any underlying issues, you are perhaps setting yourself up for trouble. And I think inference on, what is it about housing that is good versus is it that you have a distribution of people and some people are high income and some people are low income, and the high income people can afford to buy a house and the low income people may never be able to do that, and we then need to change our assumptions that is, for example, everybody will own a house, but if there is some group of people who are low income or otherwise disadvantaged, how do you make accommodation for them?
Yeah, so I'm going to follow that up again, and just if I can be indulged for a minute. I do think that one avenue of thought, right, there are a number of ways in which one can think about this, but one avenue of thought, if indeed it is believed that home ownership amongst older cohorts will diminish through time, I think it will, but it's a question of how significantly, right? If it's going to be very significant, if the Grattan figures, which are very unfiltered, right, if they're right, then that means that we confront a major task in refashioning our social protection system. And that's something that governments and policymakers generally need to be aware of. If it's, affordability has been an issue periodically throughout my whole life, right? Various times you can't afford to buy a house and it's a crisis, and then it goes away. And so there is a question of whether what we're confronting now is just a crisis that will go away, right? Or whether it's got structural underpinnings, and whether those structural underpinnings are demographically related, or whether they are in some sense financially related in a way that precludes a larger proportion of first home buyers from entering the market. I think that's a very critical question. But if indeed, there's going to be a much larger proportion of people in the future without an owner-occupied dwelling in retirement, I think then we have to rethink quite a lot of what we do in terms of older social protection.
Helen?
Helen Moore, University of Melbourne. And this, I guess this follows on from what you were saying, John. You were talking about the proportion of people in Switzerland who rent. Now, the Victorian Premier, a couple of years ago, and I don't think he's done anything about this, but he was talking about the issues of renting privately and the lack of security and the intrusion that you get when you rent privately. I mean, you're not allowed to have a pet often. You get your house inspected every 3 months. You get somebody to come in and look around your house to check that you've been looking after it properly. You're only allowed a lease for a year, and you can get tossed out at the end of the year. And I think we've got to think about the conditions of people who are renting privately as a way of improving them.
Yeah, one of the things that we cover in the brief is a discussion of ageing in place. And people have a very, very strong preference to age in the area where they've lived for a long time, to keep those social connections. And renters find that more difficult precisely because of these issues. And I think some state governments have started looking at this. There was a review in New South Wales. They didn't really make the sorts of changes that some of the people were calling for, in terms of, for example, no evictions without necessarily cause. No cause evictions, I think. But yes, there are a lot of those sorts of issues that come into it, which is that security that housing brings that renters don't have. But other countries are able to achieve some of that with longer leases, for example. So that's definitely an issue.
I just add one more point, and that was one I was going to make in response to John's point about housing, the role of social development, is you talked about how housing creates good outcomes for children and educational outcomes. But most of the literature tells us it's the stability and the security of housing, and it happens to be correlated with home ownership, and we tend to therefore assume it's home ownership that does it. But of course you can get stability and security within rental housing as long as you have the right regulations in place.
So the woman just in front of you, Silke, I think had her hand up earlier. And I'm going to actually make this the last question because I think it's good that we keep to time. I know there are a couple other hands that went up, but people have an opportunity to talk later. So.
All right, thank you very much. Marion Baird, University of Sydney. Talking about the interrelationship of policies, and Raf, you just sort of passed over this quite quickly, but I think it is a debate that's out there as well. It's this notion of if we hold back the increase in the superannuation guarantee, that could provide some funding that younger people could invest in housing. And I would like you to just elaborate on that a little bit, please, because that to me assumes that 3% would go to increased wages, or are you saying, and that may not happen as far as I can see in a current climate, or are you saying that money should go, you mentioned something about forced savings, so are you proposing a different place for that money to go?
So, I was referring to superannuation being the forced saving. So the fact that people are forced to save 9.5% of their earnings into super, which will be going up to 12% unless something changes. So there is general consensus amongst economists that it all comes out of wages. So if people didn't receive the extra 3% into their super, that employers would be able to pay them that 3% in wages. Yes, that's debatable depending on perhaps the segments of the market, to what extent employers have monopsony power. But it relates to this point about, is it that those households which are receiving lower wages because some of those wages are going into super are credit constrained and therefore not purchasing as much? And I think that's a sort of question. I don't have an answer to it, but it's something that we really need to kind of think about very, very deeply.
Yeah, I would just sort of add to that, though, those low-income households are the very households that have low bargaining power and are in jobs that are unlikely to see a wage increase. So I do feel that is a very difficult and maybe a dangerous policy path to pursue in Australia at the moment.
Maybe. I mean, at the very bottom, you have the Fair Work Commission, which would be able to regulate the minimum wage, but it depends on how far that is able to go.
But it wouldn't put an increase of 2.5%, I don't think. So.
Who let the journalists in? Sorry, Peter. So I think this is a good place to end. We now have a tea break until 11 o'clock, but join me in thanking the speakers. I think it was a great start.